What is up, everyone? My name is Joseph, and welcome back to Casually Competitive MTG, where it's our goal to bring you semi-competitive EDH gameplay content that is both fast-paced and entertaining. In today's match, we have some never-before-seen commanders on the channel, and we think you'll like what we have in store. We are continuing the trend of playing some commanders that are seen a little bit less frequently, so we think you'll enjoy what we have in store. But before we get to the opening hands, let's go over a few quick channel promotions. First off, if you like what we do and want to help support us financially, we have a Patreon as well as a YouTube join button available. We greatly appreciate everyone who does help support us in this way. It really helps us improve the quality and the frequency of these uploads. Next up, if you are looking to buy cards in the near future, be sure to check out our TCG affiliate link in the description. At no cost to you, you can help support the channel by just buying cards after you click on the link. Finally, we wanted just to mention really briefly that we are planning on attending a few events in the near future, one being Magic Fest Toronto in May, and also a cEDH tournament held by DDMGaming, also in May a little bit earlier in New Jersey. The links for both of these are in the description below if you want to find out more information, but we are planning on being at both. Also remember that we do stream EDH content every Friday at 7:30 p.m. EST on this YouTube channel, so come check that out if you're interested. And now let's get into the opening hands and deck introductions. Going first today, we have Joseph playing Derevi Empyrial Tactician. This stacks-based Bant deck looks to slow down the board using stacks pieces like Winter Orb and other Hate Bear type effects in order to get a massive amount of mana dorks and other creatures on the battlefield, so he can go to combat, swing out, untap his mana sources to play a Nexus of Fate with the goal to get infinite turns by milling himself using Cephalid Illusionist and Nomad's Encore, and then drawing Nexus of Fate for a turn and playing it every combat step. His opening hand contained a Yavimaya Coast, a Pact of Negation, a Swords to Plowshares, a Fintorn Elves, a Wild Growth, a Mana Vault, and an Aura of Silence. Going next, we have Bill, playing Kambal Consul of Allocation. The goal of this deck is to utilize Kambal's ability in order to keep his opponent's health totals low, keeping himself healthy, and then winning off of a large Ad Nauseam or something like a Necropotence to just get massive card advantage. The winning combo in this deck is usually something like reanimating a Leonin Relic Warder with something like an Animate Dead, getting infinite ETBs, and then having a pinger on the battlefield, dealing a damage to each of his opponents when it either enters or leaves the battlefield. Bill's opening hand contained a Command Tower, a Caves of Koilos, a Memnite, a Mana Vault, a Putrid Imp, an Orzhov Signet, and a Dance of the Dead. Going third, we have Adam playing Aminatou the Fateshifter. The goal of this deck is to utilize Aminatou's Blink ability to continuously blink something like a Felidar Guardian, getting infinite ETBs and winning through an Altar of the Brood. Adam did want me to mention that with his consultation lines, he likes to kick it old school, and so because of that, he does not include Thassa's Oracle in his list. He primarily uses Demonic Consultation with Jace, Wielder of Mysteries, and Laboratory Maniac. Adam's opening hand contained an Island, a Morphic Pool, and a Darkar Wastes, a Talisman of Progress, a Rhystic Study, a Toxic Deluge, and a Peregrine Drake. And finally, we have Nate playing Yahenni Undying Partisan. The goal of this deck is, first off, reanimate shenanigans to bring high-cost creatures back for a low cost, and then eventually winning through some type of infinite ETB combo like Gravecrawler or Reassembling Skeleton in combination with a mana generator like Phyrexian Altar or Pitiless Plunder. Nate's opening hand contained 3 Swamps, a Dark Ritual, a Phyrexian Reclamation, a Reassembling Skeleton, and a Toxic Deluge. Now with the opening hands and deck introductions out of the way, let's get into the gameplay. Joseph starts off this game by drawing, playing a Yavimaya Coast as his land for turn, and then tapping it for a green mana, taking 1 damage to cast a Fintorn Elves. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Bill. Bill draws and plays a Command Tower as his land for turn, and then taps the Command Tower for a black to cast a Putrid Imp. He then, for 0 mana, casts everyone's favorite free artifact, Memnite. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Adam. Adam draws and plays an untapped Morphic Pool as his land for turn, immediately shipping the turn over to Nate. Nate draws and plays a Swamp. He then taps this Swamp to cast a Dark Ritual. It resolves, and then he uses some of this black mana to cast a Reassembling Skeleton. He then uses the last floating black to cast a Phyrexian Reclamation, and when it resolves, he gives the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, draws, and taps his Fin-Torn Elves to cast a Wild Growth targeting the Yavimaya Coast. He then taps Yavimaya Coast for a colorless to produce an extra green in order to cast a Bloom Tender. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, and plays a Caves of Koilos as his land for turn, and then taps for 2 mana to cast an Orzhov Signet. He then ships the turn over to Adam. Adam untaps, draws, and plays in a Darkar Wastes as his land for turn, and then taps for 2 mana to cast a Talisman of Progress. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, draws, and plays a Swamp as his land for turn, immediately passing the turn over to Joseph. Joseph starts off his turn by untapping, drawing, and playing a Command Tower as his land for turn. He then taps Yavimaya Coast for a blue, taking 1 damage, producing an extra green, and then taps Command Tower for a white to cast his commander, Derevi, Empyrial Tactician. On ETB, Derevi's trigger untaps his Command Tower. He then taps Bloom Tender to generate 1 of each of his colors, and then taps his Command Tower for a white to cast an Aura of Silence. He uses his floating blue mana to cast a Mana Vault. With his turn 3 completed, he gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, and plays a Swamp as his land for turn, and he then taps his Caves of Koilos for a colorless to help cast his commander, Kambal Consul of Allocation. With nothing left, he ships the turn over to Adam. Adam untaps, draws, and plays a Sky Cloud Expanse as his land for turn. He then taps his mana to cast his commander, Aminatou the Fateshifter. On cast, he takes 2 damage, and Bill gains 2 life from the Kambal trigger. And Adam then activates his commander's +1 ability to draw a card, and then puts a card from his hand back on top of his library. With nothing left, he passes the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, draws, and plays a Swamp as his land for turn. He then, for 2 mana, casts a Mana Crypt. On cast, he loses 2 life, and Bill gains 2 from the Kambal trigger. He then goes to combat and swings his Reassembling Skeleton at Aminatou, dealing 1 damage. In his second main phase, he taps his mana to cast a Toxic Deluge, X equaling 4, paying 4 life into the spell. On cast, Kambal triggers, Nate loses 2 life, and Bill gains 2. And then as priorities get around for Toxic Deluge, Joseph, for 0 mana, casts a Pact of Negation. On cast, he loses 2 life, and Bill gains 2 more life. Priorities get around for Pact of Negation, and Adam, liking where this is going, pays 1 life, exiles a blue card from his hand to cast Force of Will without paying its mana cost in an attempt to counter the Pact of Negation. On cast, he takes 2 damage, and Bill gains 2 from Kambal, and then Force of Will resolves, countering the Pact of Negation, and Toxic Deluge then resolves, clearing the board of all creatures. With nothing left, Nate passes the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, draws, and without anything to do at this point and his board clear, he passes the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, and plays a Plains as his land for turn, and he then taps his mana to recast his commander, Kambal. With nothing left, he gives the turn over to Adam. Adam untaps, draws, and immediately activates his commander's +1 ability to draw a card and then put 1 card back on top of his library. He then plays an island as his land for turn and taps his mana to cast a Peregrine Drake. It resolves, and when it enters the battlefield, he untaps his lands and then gives the turn to Nate. Nate untaps and in his upkeep wins his Mana Crypt trigger, not taking any damage. He then plays a Swamp as his land for turn, and then taps his mana to cast his commander, Yahenni Undying Partisan. When it resolves, he then casts a Midnight Reaper, and with nothing left, goes to give the turn to Joseph. On Nate's end step, Joseph taps his mana to put his commander onto the battlefield using Derevi's ability. When Derevi enters the battlefield, he untaps his Yavimaya Coast, and then retaps the Yavimaya Coast for a blue, taking a damage, to cast a Brainstorm. On cast, he takes 2 damage from Kambal, and Bill gains 2, and he then draws 3 cards and puts 2 cards back on top of his library. He then goes to his turn, untaps, and in his draw step takes 1 damage from Mana Vault remaining tapped, and then draws his card for turn. He then goes to combat and swings his commander at Bill, who declares no blockers and takes 2 damage. As Bill takes the damage, the Derevi trigger untaps Joseph's Mana Vault, and then in his second main phase, he plays a Cavern of Souls as his land for turn, and when it enters, he names Sphinx. He then taps his mana to cast an uncounterable Consecrated Sphinx. With nothing left, he goes to give the turn to Bill. Bill untaps and draws, and as he draws, Joseph draws too. Bill then plays a Plains as his land for turn, and then plays an Arcane Signet, paying 4 total mana due to the Aura of Silence. He then taps for 3 mana to cast a Mana Vault. With nothing left, he gives the turn over to Adam. Adam untaps, draws, and as he draws, Joseph draws 2 cards. He then activates his commander's -3 ability to blink his Drake, and in response to the Drake's ETB, he floats 2 blue mana, 1 white mana, and 1 black mana. The Drake then re-enters the battlefield, and Adam untaps lands, and he then uses some of his floating mana to cast a Toxic Deluge, paying 6 life into the spell. On cast, Kambal triggers, dealing 2 damage to Adam, Bill gains 2, and then the Toxic Deluge resolves, and as creatures die, there are 2 Midnight Reaper triggers, and Nate loses 2 life and draws 2 cards. Nate also decides to put his commander into his graveyard. Now with the board clear, Adam taps some of his mana to help cast a Felidar Guardian. When it resolves and enters the battlefield, he blinks his commander, Aminatou. He then activates his commander's +1 ability to draw a card and put a card back on top of his library. He then, for 1 mana, casts a Preordain, scrying 2, and then drawing a card. With nothing left, he gives the turn over to Nate. Nate untaps and in his upkeep wins his Mana Crypt trigger, not taking any damage. He then draws and plays a Swamp as his land for turn, and then pays 1 black mana to cast a Reanimate, targeting the Consecrated Sphinx in Joseph's graveyard. There are no responses to Reanimate, and Nate gets his very own Consecrated Sphinx, losing 6 life when it enters the battlefield. Nate then pays 2 mana and 2 life to activate Phyrexian Reclamation to return Yahenni to his hand, and he then taps his mana to recast his commander. With nothing left, he goes to give the turn to Joseph. Joseph then goes to his turn, untaps, and in his draw step takes 1 damage from Mana Vault. He then plays a Temple Garden as his land for turn, paying 2 life to have it come in untapped. He then taps Yavimaya Coast for a blue, taking a damage and generating an additional green to help cast his commander, Derevi. When it enters, he untaps his Mana Vault. Joseph taps for 1 white mana to cast a Swords to Plowshares, targeting the Consecrated Sphinx, exiling it, and Nate then gains 4 life. He then retaps his Mana Vault to help cast a Winter Orb. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps and draws. He then taps his mana to cast a Dance of the Dead, targeting Peregrine Drake. It resolves, and when it enters the battlefield, Bill untaps 5 of his lands. He then retaps some of this mana, as well as using some of the floating mana to cast a Wishclaw Talisman. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Adam. Adam untaps 1 land due to the Winter Orb being on the battlefield, draws, and plays a River of Tears as his land for turn. He then activates his commander's +1 ability to draw a card and put a card back on top of his library. He then taps his mana to cast an Oath of Jace. Unfortunately, there is a slight rules issue here. Adam was supposed to pay 2 additional mana for this Oath of Jace. Unfortunately, we did not catch this at the time of recording, and Adam does only have 1 available mana here, so he would not have been able to pay for it. However, if he had activated his commander's minus ability to untap a permanent, he would have been able to pay for this, and in the grand scheme of the game, this mistake doesn't cause too much of an issue, so we let it slide this time. Just wanted to make you aware of this fact. Adam then draws 3 cards and discards 2, and then with nothing left, passes the turn to Nate. Nate untaps and in his upkeep loses his Mana Crypt trigger, taking 3 damage. He then draws, and with nothing to do on this turn, decides to just give the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps 1 land and in his draw step takes 1 damage from Mana Vault. He then draws and plays a Marsh Flats as his land for turn, immediately paying 1 life to crack it, searching up a Hallowed Fountain, and paying 2 life to have it enter untapped. He then goes to combat and swings Derevi at Aminatou for 2 damage. There are no blockers, and Aminatou takes the damage. With nothing left, Joseph gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps and in his draw step takes 1 damage from Mana Vault remaining tapped. He then pays 1 mana to activate Wishclaw Talisman, searching up a card to his hand and giving the talisman to Joseph. He then taps for 5 mana to cast an Ad Nauseam. Priorities get around, and Joseph taps for 1 blue mana to cast a Flusterstorm, with both copies targeting Ad Nauseam. Bill cannot pay for the Flusterstorm, Ad Nauseam is countered, and Bill then goes to pass the turn to Adam. On Bill's end step, Adam taps for 1 blue mana to cast a Mystical Tutor. It resolves, and he searches up a Demonic Consultation to the top of his library. Still in end step, knowing that Demonic Consultation is soon going to be in his hand, Joseph sacrifices his Aura of Silence to destroy Adam's Talisman of Progress, taking him off a little mana. There are no responses, the artifact is destroyed, and Adam then goes to his turn. Untaps 1 land, and then activates Aminatou's negative ability to flicker Oath of Jace, drawing 3 cards and discarding 2. He then plays a Piranha Marsh as his land for turn, and when it enters, he has it deal 1 damage to Nate. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Nate. Nate untaps and in his upkeep loses his Mana Crypt trigger, taking 3 damage. He then draws. In his first main phase, he taps his mana to cast a Bubbling Muck. It resolves and all of his swamps now tap for 2. He taps some of his swamps to help cast an Ashnod's Altar. When it resolves, he casts a Bloodghast, floating 1 black mana. He uses this black mana to cast a Skull Clamp. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps and in his draw step takes 1 damage from Mana Vault. He then draws and plays a Flooded Strand as his land for turn, and then goes to combat and swings Derevi at Nate, who declares no blockers, takes the damage, and Derevi's trigger untaps Mana Vault. He then pays 1 life to crack his Flooded Strand to search up an island to his battlefield. He then taps for 1 mana to activate Wishclaw Talisman, searching up a card to his hand and giving the talisman back to Bill. He then taps for 2 mana to cast a Rest in Peace, turning off at least one of the decks at the table. With nothing left, he passes the turn to Bill. Bill untaps and in his upkeep pays for the Dance of the Dead to untap Peregrine Drake. He then, in his draw step, takes 1 damage from Mana Vault and then draws his card for turn. He then goes to combat and swings his Drake at Aminatou and killing it. He then, in his second main phase, plays a Bloodstained Mire as his land for turn, immediately paying 1 life to crack it to search up a swamp to the battlefield. He then activates the talisman for the final time, searching a card to his hand, and mistakenly puts the used up talisman into his graveyard rather than giving it away. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Adam. Adam untaps 1 land, draws his card for turn, and with nothing to do, gives the turn to Nate. Nate untaps and in his upkeep wins his Mana Crypt trigger, not taking any damage. He then draws, and in his first main phase, pays 1 mana to equip Skull Clamp to his Bloodghast. He then remembers that Rest in Peace being on the battlefield stops the Skull Clamp draws, and he then plays a Phyrexian Tower as his land for turn and uses his Floating Cutlass to equip Skull Clamp to his commander. He then taps his mana to cast a Blood-Soaked Champion. He then goes to combat and swings Yahenni at Joseph, who declares no blockers, and takes 3 Yahenni damage. With nothing left, Nate gives the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, draws, and immediately goes to combat, swinging his commander at Nate. Nate declares no blockers, takes 2 damage, and Joseph then, with Derevi's trigger, untaps his Yavimaya Coast. He then taps the Yavimaya Coast for a colorless, producing an extra green, to cast a Sylvan Library. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps and in his draw step takes 1 damage from Mana Vault remaining tapped. He then draws and taps his mana to cast a Dark Confidant, really just looking for some card advantage at this point. However, with nothing left, he gives the turn to Adam. Adam untaps, draws, and still with nothing to do and the Winter Orb really affecting his game, Adam gives the turn to Nate. Nate untaps and in his upkeep loses his Mana Crypt trigger, taking 3 damage. He then draws and plays a Swamp as his land for turn. He then goes to combat, swinging Yahenni and his Blood-Soaked Champion at Joseph for 5 total damage. In his second main phase, Nate pays 4 mana to cast a Walking Ballista, X equaling 2. It resolves, and with nothing left, he gives the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps and draws 2 additional cards due to Sylvan Library. He decides to only keep one of them, not taking any extra damage. He then goes to combat and swings Derevi at Nate, who, when he declares no blockers, takes 2 damage, and when combat damage is dealt, Joseph untaps Derevi with Derevi's trigger. With nothing left, Joseph gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps and in his upkeep reveals a silence from the top of his library with the Dark Confidant trigger. He then, in his draw step, takes 1 damage from Mana Vault remaining tapped, and then draws a card for turn. He plays a Swamp as his land for turn, and then taps his mana to cast a Scroll Rack. He then activates Scroll Rack, exiling 2 cards, drawing 2 cards, and then putting the exiled cards on top of his library. He then taps some more of his mana to cast Azula Port Cutthroat. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Adam. Adam untaps, draws, and still with nothing to do, and Winter Orb really slowing him down, decides to give the turn to Nate. Nate untaps and in his upkeep loses his Mana Crypt trigger, taking 3 damage. He then draws and immediately goes to combat, and full swings at Joseph for a total of 7 damage. Joseph declares Derevi as a blocker for the Bloodsoaked Champion. Combat damage goes through, the Bloodsoaked Champion dies, Joseph takes 5 total damage, and Nate then removes 1 counter from Walking Ballista to deal 1 damage to Derevi, killing it. He then sacrifices his Walking Ballista to Ashnod's altar to generate 2 colorless mana. He then sacrifices Yahenni to the Ashnod's altar to generate a little bit more mana. Again, doesn't draw from Skull Clamp due to Rest in Peace, and he decides to put Yahenni back into his command zone. He then uses this floating mana to help cast Razakath. There are no responses, it resolves, and with nothing left, he decides to give the turn to Joseph. On Nate's end step, Joseph taps his mana to put his commander back onto the battlefield using Derevi's ability, and when it enters the battlefield, Joseph decides to tap down Nate's Razakath. Joseph then goes to his turn, untaps, and in his draw step takes 1 damage from Mana Vault remaining tapped. He then draws 2 extra cards due to Sylvan Library, and decides to just keep 1 of them. He then, for 0 mana, casts a Chrome Mox, and when it enters the battlefield, he exiles Verity Circle. He then goes to combat and swings Derevi at Nate, who declares no blockers, takes damage, and Joseph decides to untap Derevi with Derevi's trigger. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps and in his upkeep reveals an Animate Dead from the top of his library, taking 2 damage from Dark Confidant. He then, in his draw step, takes 1 damage from Mana Vault remaining tapped, and then draws his card for turn. He then activates Scroll Rack for 2, and he then taps his mana to cast a Sensei's Divining Top, and when that resolves, he uses some more of his mana to cast a Bloodchief Ascension. With nothing left, he goes to pass the turn to Adam. On Bill's end step, Adam taps for 1 black mana to cast a Demonic Consultation. It resolves, and Adam decides to name a card that is actually in his library. He names Altar of the Brood. He exiles the top 6 cards of his library, none of them are Altar of the Brood, and he then exiles cards until he finds it. He puts it to his hand, and then goes to his turn. He untaps, draws his card for turn, he plays an Interplanar Beacon as his land for turn, and then for 1 mana, casts Altar of the Brood. It resolves, and he then taps his mana to cast a Spark Double. When it enters the battlefield, he makes it enter as a copy of Felidar Guardian. When the new Felidar Guardian enters the battlefield, Adam's opponents each mill a card, and Adam decides to blink his original Felidar Guardian. His original Felidar Guardian re-enters the battlefield, milling his opponents for 1, and deciding to blink the Spark Double. He then performs this loop enough times, blinking his permanents until all of his opponents are milled out completely into exile, since the Rest in Peace is on the battlefield, and he then decides to stop the loop by blinking any of his other permanents. He then passes the turn, and as each of his opponents go to draw their card for turn, they each lose the game, and Adam wins the game. In conclusion, this game was honestly just really cool. There were a lot of interaction pieces here, a lot of people trying to go off, and the stacks, honestly, I think was done in a way that kept the game interesting and still interactive. There were a lot of people threatening a win very frequently, and the stacks pieces allowed that win to be slowed down a little bit. However, the threat was always still there, so everyone was kind of just on their toes. That being said, in terms of a most valuable card for this game, does have to go to Toxic Deluge, and not just one of them, but both of them together. This card in general just played a large impact in the early game of this game, and really kept the game going for the players who played them when they did. If the first and second Toxic Deluge weren't cast, Joseph's board state would have been massive, and he would have been getting so much value through mana and through the Consecrated Sphinx. So just in general, not through a single play, but just the card in general of Toxic Deluge, I think really had a large impact in this game overall. I will have to give a quick shout out to the stacks pieces. Winter Orb and Aura of Silence definitely did a good job at slowing down Joseph's opponents while he dug for some type of answer or win. Unfortunately, he just wasn't able to get there in time, and his life total prevented him from taking advantage of things like the Sylvan Library. So while they were effective in slowing down his opponents, he just was unfortunately not able to get there to capitalize on that. All in all, this was a really well-played game by everyone at the table, and if you enjoyed this game, you're really going to like what we have for episode number 4 of Season 2. As a little sneak peek for those who are listening at this point, it is a double header, and one of the decks that is featured is a deck that I have been looking to build and waiting to rebuild actually for a long time, and although I am a little biased, I think it's a fantastic game, and I think you guys will really enjoy it. That being said, that is all we have for this video. We here at Casually Competitive hope you enjoyed it. Again, I am Joseph. This is Casually Competitive MTG, and we will see you next time.